Hi, I'm Linda Gastrich. I'm the lead pastor at Webster Hills United Methodist Church, and this is the message that we offered on Sunday, December 2nd, the first Sunday of Advent. So let me take you back to a time long ago when the world was very different, certainly much smaller than it seems today. And let's go to a city that sits on the desert, where conditions for life can be harsh. Let's talk to the people in that city and begin to hear them as they share their deepest worries and fears. You see, they know that their lives are about to change. They know that armies are beginning to position themselves all around their city. And they understand that eventually there will be no escape and that they will be tormented in the waiting. Their supplies will dwindle and they will grow hungry, thirsty, weary. And eventually, the city will be taken and the battle will be brutal. They've been warned, you see, that all of this is about to happen. There's a young prophet in the city who seems to know what is about to take place, and people are now paying attention. In fact, even the king has heard his voice. But the king grew so tired of his warnings of gloom and doom that he had that prophet arrested and thrown into jail. The king, you see, will welcome the armies. His life will not be in danger. The wealthy people who love, follow, and serve the king, they're going to be okay as well. In fact, the ones who are going to suffer the most will be the people who are known as the people of God. They are the people who see God as their king. And they are the people who are now no longer in charge of their city, even though they consider Jerusalem to be their holy city. They are the people who do not place their hope for their future in a human king, but they are people who believe that one day the Messiah will come and once again life will be very different. And if you listen closely enough, you can hear that the prophet Jeremiah has not been silenced by being tossed into jail. He's still speaking in a voice that is clear and unafraid, but his message is different now. Instead of words of warning, he's offering words of comfort. From Jeremiah in the 33rd chapter, verses 14 through 16, Jeremiah said, "The time is coming, declares the Lord, when I will fulfill my gracious promise with the people of Israel and Judah. And in those days and at that time I will raise up a righteous branch from David's line, who will do what is just and right in the land. And in those days Judah will be saved and Jerusalem will live in safety. And this is what he will be called: the Lord is our righteousness." You see, in the midst of the fear and worry and pending disaster, the prophet spoke words of hope to the people of Jerusalem. He said, "What you see around you now is not the end. And what you see around you now is not what God desires. Lift up your heads and see what is possible." George Orwell is often considered to be the very first person to write what we now call dystopian novels or stories. His book 1984 was published in 1944, and he set his story some 40 years into the future and described a civilization that had been touched by war and civil conflict and revolution. And Orwell's work launched a type of storytelling that has become quite popular and is now becoming even more so. Think Hunger Games, or The Handmaid's Tale, or Divergent, or Maze Runner. Such novels are frequently on the bestseller list of young adult works. And these stories describe events in which social or political forces have taken control. Freedoms are limited. The people who rebel, they're often punished, and often punished in public and in humiliating ways. And while these fictional accounts of tyrants and new world orders and dark futures might seem bleak and hardly entertaining, they're popular because they almost always offer up a glimmer of hope. Somebody who will step up, a man or a woman, and lead a revolution and set the world to right. Jeremiah did not just talk about hope in the future. Before he was arrested, he did something bold. He bought some land. Now, that may not sound like much, but trust me, it meant something, because he bought land in a war zone. Who does that? He paid for the land. He made certain that the transaction was properly recorded. And he did this as a way of saying to the Israelites that while, yes, Babylon was going to take over their city, Babylon's possession of the city would not last forever. Some 70 years later, the city would be returned to them. Now, of course, many of the people who were with Jeremiah at the time would be long gone before 70 years passed. In fact, Jeremiah would be as well. The purchase then was an investment in the generations that would come later. One of Jeremiah's heirs would eventually own the land and be able to plant crops and build homes and enjoy life on that land. And buying it was a way for Jeremiah to say, what is happening now does not define us, and it will not define us in the future. Jesus also spoke some words of warning. In Luke chapter 21, starting with verse 25, he said this. He said, there will be signs in the moon and the sun and the stars. On earth there will be disarray among nations in their confusion over the roaring of the sea and the surging waves. The planets and other heavenly bodies will be shaken, causing people to faint from fear and from foreboding of what is coming upon the world. They will see the human one coming on a cloud with power and great splendor. And when these things begin to happen, stand up straight and raise your heads, because your redemption is near. And then Jesus told them a parable. He said, look at the fig tree and all the trees. When they sprout leaves, you can see for yourselves and know that summer is near. In the same way, when you see these things happening, you know that God's kingdom is near. And I assure you that this generation won't pass away until everything has happened. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words certainly will not pass away. Take care that your hearts aren't dulled by drinking parties and drunkenness and the anxieties of day-to-day life. Don't let that day fall upon you unexpectedly like a trap. It will come upon everyone who lives on the face of the whole earth. Stay alert at all times, praying that you are strong enough to escape everything that is about to happen and to stand before the human one. Now, I'll admit it's a little more difficult to hear hope in these words from Jesus. This passage is often used to describe Jesus' return to earth from heaven, his second coming. And they're often used, I think, sometimes to frighten us into righteous living. Because if we don't, Jesus says bad things will happen to us. And then they're often used to make the faithful feel a little more righteous than the rest of the world, telling us that when Jesus comes, we're going to be okay. It's too bad about the others. But I'd like you to do this. Consider whether Jesus wasn't so much predicting the future, but saying what everyone knew was the truth. Life is not always easy. And in this moment, Jesus was saying that we should not only be watchful, but we should be paying attention to how we are living. It's less of a question of when will all these things happen, and more a question of how do we live in the meantime. That's the conspiracy that God invites you and me to enter. A conspiracy that looks at the world around us, a world that asks us to be focused almost solely on fear, to lift up our heads and see the hope, and to know that neither getting caught up in living in excess nor getting caught up in living in the fear is going to serve us well. The ancient prophet Jeremiah spoke of the redemption that was to come. And Jesus spoke of the kingdom of God that would one day come to earth. Today, we can conspire with God to be people who do stand in the midst of all that is worrisome and all that causes hurt, and say, there's another way. No matter what comes, when our lives are marked by the grace and love and reconciliation of God, then we have nothing to fear. So I think most of us would say that the crazy side of Christmas comes earlier every year. And I know it's easy to complain about how overdone Christmas decorations can be and how loud the Christmas music can be in all the stores. And it's easy to be bothered by the overabundance of the Christmas commercials and the constant message that if you're not buying something, you're not going to be happy. It's easy to find everything that's wrong with this time of year and grumble about it. But the world around us does offer something helpful for this time of year. It helps us see that we live in a time that is full of the present and the not yet of God's kingdom. It helps us see that tension between the reality in which we live and God's vision for our future. And so I would say this time of year we can be in a season of celebration, and at the same time we can be in a season of waiting. We can be in a season of grief, and we can be in a season of joy. And we can be in a season of recognizing the hurt that's around us, and be in a season of knowing that God is at work through this world and through us and through God's Son, Jesus Christ. You see, it's about hope, and that's what Jeremiah was telling the people back then. Hope stands in opposition to fear, and hope, I think, is truly at the heart of our Christian faith. Life that will not be defeated by death, light that will not be defeated by darkness, good that will not be defeated by evil, and that in God's time all things will come to a good end. It's important to remember, though, that hope is different from optimism. Optimism is expecting that things will get better. Hope says, no matter what happens, God's word and promise will remain. Hope helps us see, just as Jeremiah was willing to invest in a piece of land, so is God willing to invest in us. And that investment is Jesus sent to live with us in human form, our sign of hope and our sign of resilience in the face of trouble. This time of year ought to be a time that just messes with us, at least a little bit. That we're busy preparing for Christmas Day, confident that we know that it will arrive and all that will happen, but that we also are beginning the season with reminders from Jesus that we don't know what will happen or when, that we begin with a story from an ancient prophet of long ago, reminding us that what we see now is not all there is. And so the question for us truly is this: how do we live in the meantime? And how do we live as people who do believe in the hope of Jeremiah and in the hope of Jesus? I think we can do so in part, at least, by being willing to cut through the noise and the distractions of the season and just look. Look for signs of hope. And look for branches of righteousness starting to spring up. In this season of hope, of waiting, of watching, let's you and I live as people who believe that in the midst of darkness, light is about to break in. And in the midst of despair, there is hope. And that after long waiting, a branch will sprout. The complete fulfillment of all of God's promises has not yet happened, but it is coming. Such is our faith, and such is our hope. Amen.